the names of persons of all classes, of officers of every rank, from the marshal down to the commissary of wars, were to be found on this list, but in still greater number were the names of civil functionaries of every rank, from the ambassador down to his diplomatic agents and simple employees. Some had received sums of money, other presents for their wives or for themselves. The emperor repeatedly insisting on seeing this list, received it at last from the Prince d'Aumale. Napoleon placed it in the hands of the minister of the public treasury with orders to sue for the recovery of these sums, which had thus been extorted or illegally received. The soldiers, for whom there was more excuse under the circumstances, were less roughly treated than the civilians who could justify themselves by no motive. The latter were accordingly more severely treated, but it was thought advisable to treat certain persons in high positions with tolerance. Some of the fraudulent bailees paid back what they had received. The fall of the empire saved the most guilty. The resentment retained by the persons compromised by this affair can be imagined. There lies the reasons of many desertions and outbreaks of hostility which manifested themselves against the emperor when he was no longer to be feared. The Duc de Cador received orders to inform one of the diplomatic agents whose name was mentioned on the list supplied by the Hamburg Senate, who had been plenipotentiary minister to the Hanseatic cities, that he had to count with him as a clerk with his master and to pay over to the treasury of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 75% of the sums which he had received. This money to be applied to finishing a mansion which had been commenced on the Quai d'Orsay, and which was intended for the ministry offices and residence. The reason of the order signified to Bourrienne by the Duc de Cador is more in accordance with truth than the somewhat cynical answer of which the latter boasts in his Memoirs. Since I have related an occurrence which showed that Napoleon, in spite of his vigilance, was unable to prevent all disorder, I will quote another of the same kind, which took place later on, and which was not known, at least officially, by the emperor. For what reason will be seen. During the 1807 campaign, a war indemnity of 300,000 francs was imposed on the province of Erfurt. Deputies from this province came to headquarters to ask for a reduction. Count Daru, to whom they addressed themselves, received them very badly. But they repeated their application so often that the minister told them that they did wrong to complain, seeing that the sum of 300,000 francs which had been demanded of them was not more than the resources of their provinces could afford. If we only owe 300,000 francs, they answered, we have paid. Have you receipts in order? In answer to this question, they produced a receipt from the assigner of payments. Count Daru wrote to the latter, who admitted to him that the marshal in command of the army corps, which was stationed at that time in the province, and who since was raised to a rank which put him above the reach of all jurisdiction, had allotted 200,000 francs out of the money received to himself, and had allowed him to keep 100,000 francs. Count Daru informed this functionary that unless the entire sum was paid into the army treasury within an assigned period, the emperor would be informed of the matter. In consequence of this, the assigner of payments made haste to pay over the 300,000 francs. He, however, declared that he had paid the whole sum out of his pocket, as the marshal had refused to restore the 200,000 francs which he had appropriated. Monsieur Daru never informed the emperor of this affair, and it was only 20 years later that he revealed it in private conversation. On September 19, 1811, Napoleon left Compiègne for his proposed journey in Holland. His object was to visit this peculiar country, the originality of which attracted his attention. He proposed to see the works which had either been finished or were in course of execution, necessary for binding his third capital, to the metropolitan seat of the empire and intended to render communications between Amsterdam and Paris most rapid. The emperor accordingly preceded the empress, giving her rendezvous in Antwerp, as he wished to spare her the fatigues of a military journey, in which, moreover, she would have been forced to dispense with the pomp attaching to her rank. Marie-Louise, after leaving Compiègne, proceeded to the castle of Laeken. Napoleon was not displeased at the idea of her appearing in provinces which formerly had been governed by the House of Austria. The empress made several excursions to Brussels, where she was received as she had a right to expect. She showed herself at the theater and visited certain manufactories, where she ordered lace for a considerable amount. The emperor wished to surround her journey to Holland with considerable splendor and expressed his wish that the empress should show herself everywhere, surrounded by a brilliant court. As for himself, accompanied by only a small suite, he proceeded to Bologna, where he spent 3 days visiting the little coast harbors, inspecting the flotilla, and engaging it with some English cruisers, over whom he secured a victory. From Bologna, Napoleon went towards Ostend and Breskens, a port situated opposite Flushing, where he had ordered certain works to be carried out. The weather was detestable, which did not prevent the emperor from riding part of the way on horseback. He explored the island of Cadzand and examined its forts in detail. His plan was to visit one by one the 30 vessels of the fleet at Antwerp, a review which would have benefited the fleet in particular and the navy in general. With this purpose in view, embarked on the Charlemagne, the admiral's vessel, on which Commander Missisi had hoisted his standard. He was accompanied by his Minister of Marine. The weather was fairly fine, but it changed during the night, and from daybreak a violent storm raged, which lasted 3 days without diminishing in intensity. The equinoctial winds were so strong that no boat could be put to sea. The emperor was accordingly forced to remain on board the Charlemagne in idleness, without being able to communicate with the land. He took advantage of this enforced stay to examine a report of the state of the fleet, in distributing rewards amongst the sailors, and armed with his field glasses in contemplating the spectacle of the furious waters whenever he was able to keep his legs on the bridge or on the deck. Napoleon's papers and almost all his clothes were on board some boats and a yacht, which were dispersed by the wind into various ports along the coast. The pages and people of his household who were in charge of these boats were driven about at the mercy of the winds for 4 or 5 days without being able to reach either the emperor's ship or to get back to land, menaced with destruction at every moment. Many thought of writing their wills without knowing whether these documents would survive them. The tempest having calmed at last, and the sea having somewhat quieted, the emperor took advantage of this circumstance to make his way to Flushing. He spent a day there, which he employed in inspecting the immense works which were being carried out by his order, given after the withdrawal of the English expedition. The object of these works was to enable the armed fleet of the Escaut to enter into port so as to be protected against hostile attack. Napoleon next embarked for Antwerp, sailing up the river and inspecting in turn the various forts which lie on either bank. He arrived at Antwerp in the night and was joined there by the empress next day. During a stay of 4 days in the city, where fetes of every kind succeeded each other, the emperor did not remain inactive for a single minute. His attention was entirely taken up with the city and the military, maritime, and commercial establishments which his genius for organization had created in so short a space of time. In 4 years, he had transformed Antwerp into a new city and fortified town of the first order and the most important port in his empire. Quays, piers, canals, harbor basins, docks with 30 vessels in process of construction, unbroken roads from Flushing to Antwerp, protected by lines of forts, where 100 vessels could find shelter in case of danger. All these things had come from hands which seemed to be gifted with the power of a magician's wand. Napoleon left Antwerp on October 4th at 3 o'clock in the morning, stopped at Williamstadt and Helvoetsluis, slept in his yacht, which was at anchor near the island of Goree, and arrived on the following day at Gorkum, where he found Marie-Louise. The Arch-Treasurer, Governor-General of Holland, and Marshal Oudinot, commanding the troops, who had both come to meet him, were there also. The emperor continued his journey, accompanied by the empress, along a road fringed with country houses, each more elegant and better kept than the last. He stopped at Utrecht. Their majesties were received there by the authorities and by an immense crowd of people whom neither the bad weather nor the darkness could prevent from thronging the quays and streets. Before entering the house prepared for this reception, Napoleon got on horseback and went to review the troops in spite of the pouring rain. This circumstance reminds me that, during a review which was being held on a rainy day, Napoleon saw some generals who drew aside to wrap themselves up carefully in their mantles. Without appearing to notice the excessive care which they were taking of their persons, Napoleon at once made his way to a water spout and took his stand close to it, thus giving his generals a lesson in discipline and self-denial. On returning to his house, the emperor, in pursuance of his system of practical education, insisted, without taking the time to change his clothes, on receiving the authorities of the town who had come to await him there. Amongst the corporations admitted to the audience were noticed some Jansenist clericals whose rupture with the court of Rome had recently been accomplished. The solemn entry of the imperial couple into Amsterdam was effected on October 9th. The empress was in a state carriage, gilded and fitted with 8 windows. A guard of honor composed of young men belonging to the best families in the town had come to meet their majesties. The emperor made his entry into the town on horseback, surrounded by a brilliant staff. On that day, the Dutch seemed to have forgotten their natural stolidity altogether. Their majesties spent a fortnight in Amsterdam. The emperor broke his stay in the city by excursions to the Helder, which was one of his creations, to Texel, to the famous dikes at Medemblik. Some very lofty dikes had been raised on this point, which protected the country against the waters of the Zuider Zee. The land lies lower than the sea, the waves of which sometimes reach as high as the top of the dike. The dikes are then covered over with sails to break the force of the waves and to prevent them from overthrowing the ramparts which the industry of the inhabitants had raised. During one of the emperor's absences, which lasted 3 days, the empress made several excursions in the surroundings of Amsterdam. She stopped notably at the village of Broek, which is famed as being the best model of the mincing luxuriousness and excessive cleanliness of the Dutch. No carriages pass through the streets, which are paved with tiles imitating flowers. But an exception was made to this rule in favor of the empress's carriage. The house which she had come to visit was the mayor's. She saw the state rooms there, which are only opened on days of marriages, christenings, and funerals. Except on these 3 solemn occasions, the apartment is kept carefully closed up, and even the 3 steps which lead up to the door are removed. The frontages of some houses are covered with white sand, on which patterns are marked out in colored sand. The inside of these houses is as clean and polished as the outside. Curtains of beautiful Chinese silk garnished the windows. Large cupboards were filled with Japanese porcelain. No traces of any inhabitants were to be seen, nor could one notice any marks of usage on the furniture. These houses appeared to have been placed there like an opera stage scene for the mere pleasure of the eyes. There are, in this village, or rather in this symmetrical assemblage of pleasure houses of which Nuremberg toys are the miniature, neither barns nor lofts nor stables nor cowhouses nor kitchens. Whatever of animals or even intellectual life there may be is placed outside the limits of the village. People sleep and eat, no doubt, hidden from all eyes, for one cannot admit that these houses are only used as the dwelling places of spirits. The mayor or burgomaster thought he was giving the empress no mean mark of his respect in breaking for her the rules which he obeyed himself. The entry into one of these houses had even been, on one occasion, refused to Hortense, Queen of Holland, and the king had approved of this because she had not announced her visit in advance. The owners were all millionaires and had always been carefully treated because they were the pillars of Dutch commerce. Even during the Revolution, no troops were billeted upon them, nor were they forced to do any personal service. These Republicans, in consequence, are very proud and make no exceptions of persons nor of ranks. Another township of celebrated name is Sardam, where the Tsar Peter the Great passed several months to study the art of shipbuilding. This township, although this name is no more applicable to Sardam than to Broke, consists of a succession of houses where modern luxury is combined with the most rare antiquities and that refined cleanliness which is the mania of the Dutch. These houses cover a space of nearly 3/4 of a league. Sardam, like Broke, is inhabited by merchants who have grown rich in the Indian and China trade. But what especially attracts the attention of the curious, there is a poor hut of 2 rooms made of planks, lacking the comforts of life, without either courtyard or loft, and altogether much resembling a barn. The camp bedstead on which Peter the Great slept is kept there. The bare walls are covered with inscriptions in honor of this monarch, who was great, even in his eccentricities. There are in a cupboard in which he put his clothes and provisions 2 large volumes, pages of which are covered with the names of strangers who have come to visit this abode, and who remained struck with the contrast between the power of the great prince who inhabited it and the humble condition which he assumed. Napoleon, in honor of Peter the Great, raised Sardam to the rank of a town. The journey in Holland was very brilliant. The emperor was followed by his orders by a large court and by many of his ministers. Talma, Dumas, Mademoiselle Bourgoin, and part of the Théâtre Français had been sent for to give performances. The dramatic poet Chazet, during this journey, gave a performance of a piece, the Sardam Workshop, which he had written. The Dutch were much pleased with the Empress Marie-Louise. Her simple and affable manners appealed to the Dutch good nature. I do not know whether the love of novelty, or rather the prestige of Napoleon's great name, influenced the Dutch. The reception which they everywhere awarded to the Emperor and Empress was such as to make one think that the annexation of their country to France was approved of them all. The emperor allowed no day to pass without going out with no other escort than the guard of honor of the town, either to make excursions to the military and naval stations in the surroundings of Amsterdam, or to visit the manufactories, docks, harbor, arsenal, vessels, flotilla, or to hold reviews. He received all the authorities in audience, conversed with each man on a special subject, asking questions about the various localities, the rules of government, the state of mind of the inhabitants, the material and moral condition of the country, its customs, and so on. From these conversations, from his own observation, Napoleon, with that prompt and subtle penetration which has never been equaled, acquired exact notions of everything which attracted his attention. He settled the question of public instruction in Holland by a decree. Imperial universities were established in the cities of Leyden and Groningen. Public schools were established in both these cities and in Utrecht. Secondary schools were granted to every town in Holland. It was at Amsterdam that the emperor created the Order of La Réunion. This order, like that of the Legion of Honor, was intended to recompense civil and military services and remain more especially affected to the cities annexed by the empire. Napoleon argued with the governor general and with the indefatigable Monsieur Daru, Minister's Secretary of State, in what way he could remedy the evil results of the suspension of maritime trade, which were being felt by the Dutch. He manifested the great benevolence towards them, was present at all the fetes given in his honor, speaking to each man on the subjects which most concerned him, remembering everybody with the amenity, good grace, which he knew how to display, and in which it must be said that he was marvelously seconded by the Empress.